August 20th, 1862. The calm of Lake Shetek was shattered when Mrs. Hurd stepped outside to tend to the cows. What seemed like a typical day on the Minnesota frontier soon turned into a fight for survival. The Dakota, once peaceful neighbors, had come with a different purpose. They weren't here to trade tobacco. They weren't here for food. They had come with deadly intent. In a flash, everything changed. Mr. Vaught, the family's trusted helper, fell to the ground dead. Mrs. Hurd's child did not survive the attack. And the Dakota warriors, with their cold eyes and deadly intentions, weren't leaving until they had everything they came for. This was just the beginning. For the survivors, the real fight for survival had just begun. Quick pause, tell us where in the world you're watching from. If you're enjoying the story, hit subscribe, and don't forget to like and share. Now, let's get back to the tale. It was a quiet morning on the Eastlick farm. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the land, where cows grazed peacefully by the barn. Lavina Eastlick stood at the kitchen window, her gaze lost in the simple serenity of her family's life at Lake Shetek. The farm, though small, had been a place of peace and promise since she and her husband, John, had settled here. For years, they had exchanged food and tobacco with the nearby Dakota, who had lived on this land long before settlers arrived. Today, Lavina felt a rare moment of peace. The hardships of the past, the long journey from the east, and the challenges of farm life seemed like distant memories. But in the air, there was something that felt off, a tension that she couldn't quite place. John had always been the cautious one. He often spoke about the need for more protection, how they might need a fort closer to them. Lavina, on the other hand, had grown used to their occasional visits. It was not unusual for Dakota warriors to ask for food or tobacco, particularly in times of hunger. But something about today felt different. As Lavina glanced out the window again, she saw her husband speaking with their eldest son, Merton, near the barn. The two had been working on repairs, but John's face was tense, as if he had been feeling that same unease. The Dakota had always been part of their lives here. It was common for them to come around asking for help. But today, the air was thick with something darker, a sense of growing uncertainty that weighed heavily on Lavina's chest. Suddenly, the sound of hooves in the distance drew her attention. At first, she didn't think much of it. Dakota warriors often passed by, asking for handouts. But today, there were more riders than usual. A small group, then another, until she counted over a dozen warriors. Her heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. She quickly made her way out of the cabin, her mind racing as she tried to assess the situation. It wasn't just the number of warriors, there was something different in the way they approached, in the way their eyes scanned the land. They weren't here just to ask for tobacco. This time, they had a purpose. Something was about to happen. Though Elizabeth had grown used to the occasional visit from Dakota groups asking for food, today something felt different. As she approached the right cabin, the sight of multiple teepees caught her eye. The Dakota had always come in small numbers, but now they were gathering in larger groups. Tensions between the settlers and the Dakota had been rising for months. Elizabeth saw Pawn, a familiar face, standing among the group. He greeted her with his usual, "Ho, ho, ho." But today, his gaze lingered on her horse, not her. Elizabeth knew something was wrong. The Dakota had always been cautious, but today, it was as if they were preparing for something much larger. By the evening of August 18th, Elizabeth's fears were confirmed. Her son, Merton, burst through the door. "Pa, someone's coming!" Charlie Hatch, their neighbor, had ridden in from the north. His face was pale. "The Indians are attacking!" "They're attacking settlements. Families are being wiped out." Charlie had discovered the body of Vaught, a local helper, lying by the herd cabin, shot by Dakota warriors. Panic gripped Elizabeth's heart as she realized the Dakota were no longer asking for food, they were coming for something more. The Dakota were hungry, desperate, and angry. For months, the U.S. government had ignored the promises of annuities, payments meant to feed and clothe the Dakota. Without these provisions, many of the Dakota had resorted to desperate measures. including attacking settlements for food and supplies. The settlers, who had always maintained friendly relations with the Dakota, were now caught in a storm they had not anticipated. The settlers had no time to think. John grabbed their rifles, and Elizabeth, holding baby Johnny, ran with the children, knowing that their lives depended on the speed with which they could escape. The Dakota, though not yet in sight, were near. Elizabeth's feet burned from running, but there was no time for pain. The prairie, which had once been a peaceful home, now felt like a battleground. Behind them, the sound of galloping hooves echoed through the air. The Dakota were closing in, and the settlers' only hope was to outrun them. Their flight led them to the right cabin, hoping for refuge, but the sight that met them was chilling. The Dakota had already set up camp there. Elizabeth's gaze locked onto Pawn. His face, once friendly, now betrayed a deeper truth. He wasn't here to help them. The Dakota were raiding settlers with a clear purpose, survival, and revenge. In the years prior, Elizabeth had never imagined that the Dakota, once peaceful neighbors, would turn on them. But as the U.S. government continued to break treaties and failed to provide, the Dakota were left with nothing. Their hunger, their desperation, had led them to this brutal point. The war cries of the Dakota warriors filled the air as they encircled the right cabin. Inside, the settlers had no choice but to prepare for an attack. Elizabeth's heart raced as she held baby Johnny, listening to the distant sounds of the warriors. Her body tensed. They were hopelessly outnumbered. The Dakota had come for retribution. The government's failure to honor treaties had pushed the Dakota to their breaking point. The settlers were caught in the middle, now victims of a war they had never expected. Pawn stepped forward, delivering an ultimatum. Leave, or stay and fight. His voice was cold, devoid of the warmth Elizabeth had once trusted. The Dakota were here to claim what had been denied to them for so long. There was no longer any room for peace. John turned to Elizabeth, his face hardening. We leave. We run, he said. It was the only choice they had. The Dakota were too many, and staying meant certain death. Elizabeth, barefoot and panicked, raced alongside her children, clutching Johnny. They were now fugitives in their own land. Behind them, the sound of galloping hooves and war cries grew louder. The Dakota were closing in. They had no idea where they were headed, just that they had to outrun the death that was chasing them. The prairie, once a place of life and laughter, had become a barren wasteland of fear. The settlers were no longer safe in their own homes. They stumbled upon a slough, tall grass offering brief refuge. Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest, but she knew they couldn't stay here long. The Dakota were relentless. The air was thick with the sound of hooves, and the settlers crouched low, praying they wouldn't be discovered. The Dakota were driven by more than hunger. They were fighting for survival against a government that had betrayed them. The settlers, caught in the crossfire, had no choice but to run for their lives. As the Dakota closed in, Elizabeth faced an impossible decision. Frank, her son, could no longer continue. Every step was a struggle, and Elizabeth knew that stopping would mean death for everyone else. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling, and kissed his forehead one last time. There were no words, only the crushing weight of what she was being forced to do. With the sound of pursuit growing closer, Elizabeth turned away, carrying the pain with her as she led the others forward. Survival demanded a choice no parent should ever have to make. Elizabeth did not leave out of lack of love, but because it was the only way to save her remaining children. As the night wore on, the settlers were betrayed by Pawn. His allegiance had always been unclear, but now it was undeniable. He was with the Dakota. The man who had once shared their table was now part of the very group that was hunting them. Pawn's betrayal was the final blow. The settlers realized they were truly on their own. The Dakota had nothing to lose, and they would show no mercy today. The settlers' brief respite in the swamp was shattered by the unmistakable sound of approaching riders. The Dakota were close now, their voices carrying through the trees as the ground trembled beneath pounding hooves. Elizabeth's heart raced as she realized they were being surrounded. Escape was slipping away. John gripped his rifle tightly, his face set in grim determination. "Get ready," he whispered. "This is it." The rhythmic beat of drums echoed in the distance, a stark reminder that the settlers were facing a conflict far larger than themselves. Years of broken promises and hunger had brought them here, and now both sides were caught in a fight for survival. As the figures drew closer, Elizabeth understood that danger was immediate and every choice mattered. John and the other men took their positions, rifles raised, eyes scanning the fog-laden slough. The Dakota, some on horseback and some on foot, advanced steadily, showing no sign of hesitation. The settlers were cornered. Elizabeth watched as her husband and the men fired. But the riders pressed on, unaffected. Their numbers were overwhelming, and the settlers' weapons were old, with limited ammunition. Elizabeth's thoughts raced. How long could they hold out? The tension in the air was suffocating, and her children's safety weighed heavily on her mind. Every passing moment reminded her that survival depended on more than strength. It required careful timing, courage, and a bit of luck. There was no room for error. A single shot rang out, cutting through the air. John had fired, and one of the approaching riders fell from his horse. The pause was brief. As the men reloaded, more riders closed in, narrowing the settlers' options. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she pulled her children behind a large tree, seeking cover from the chaos around them. The fight was overwhelming. The settlers, though determined, struggled to hold their ground against the advancing riders. Sounds of movement, shouted commands, and the clatter of hooves filled the air, leaving little room for rest or reprieve. Elizabeth realized their survival depended not just on returning fire, but on finding a path to safety. They were cornered, but staying put was not an option. Every step, every decision mattered in the effort to escape the relentless pursuit. As they ran, they came upon another swath of high grass, a narrow strip of swamp that seemed like their only hope. The water was cold and stagnant, but it offered some semblance of cover. Elizabeth's feet were numb, her body screaming for rest, but she couldn't stop. Her children, frightened and exhausted, clung to her. Merton, though tired, still took charge of his younger siblings, guiding them through the murky waters. Elizabeth was amazed at his strength. Her eldest son had become a protector in the span of a few days. She couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, despite the dire circumstances. As they huddled together in the swamp, Elizabeth could hear the distant sound of hooves. The Dakota were still coming, but for now, they were safe. The question was how long they could stay hidden. This completes the next chapters in the story with corrections for repetition and historical accuracy integrated into the script. The cinematic storytelling is maintained with varied sentence structures, and the emotional stakes are high as Elizabeth and her family continue their journey of survival. As the night wore on, the Dakota closed in on the settlers' last hope. The cold was biting, and Elizabeth could feel her body weakening. The strain of days without rest, the constant fear, the loss, it was all catching up to her. But just as her hope began to flicker out, a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, Elizabeth couldn't make out who it was, but as the figure drew closer, she saw a man on horseback, the mail carrier. She didn't know who he was or where he came from, but the relief she felt in that moment was indescribable. The soldiers were close. She could feel it. Maybe, just maybe, they had found a way out. "Who are you?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice hoarse from the days of running and fear. "I'm a mail carrier," the man said, his voice weary but filled with purpose. "I've heard of what's been happening. I'm heading east toward New Ulm. I can get you there." The settlers, exhausted and beaten down, didn't hesitate. They followed the mail carrier through the woods, their hearts still pounding from the close encounter with the Dakota warriors. The air around them felt thick, each step taken in trepidation, as though every sound could be the echo of approaching danger. Elizabeth clutched her children close, glancing back every few seconds, expecting to see the silhouettes of Dakota warriors closing in. The thought that they could still be overtaken was always at the back of her mind. The mail carrier led them to a small cabin, a temporary refuge. It wasn't much, but it was a chance for them to rest and regroup. Elizabeth stood at the door, holding baby Johnny close, still unsure if they were truly safe. The war cries had stopped, but she knew how fleeting peace could be. Inside the cabin, they sat by the fire, finally able to rest their weary bones. Elizabeth let herself relax, for the first time in days, but it was only a brief respite. She could feel the weight of what they had endured pressing on her chest, a constant reminder that they weren't out of danger yet. Merton, now a young man, sat near the fire with the younger children. Johnny slept in his arms, his face peaceful, unaware of the horrors they had just survived. Elizabeth watched her son, feeling a bittersweet mixture of pride and sadness. He had grown so much, so quickly. It felt like only yesterday he was a little boy, innocent and full of life. But now, he was their protector. He was learning the same lessons of survival she had learned all those years ago. The next morning, the settlers prepared to leave the cabin and continue their journey. The Dakota were never far behind, and the mail carrier couldn't promise them safety for long. But for now, they had a chance, however small it might be. "We go east, to New Ulm," the mail carrier said. "It's a place of refuge for those who've survived." Elizabeth nodded, her heart heavy but determined. She looked around at her children, at the people she had fought so hard to protect. The journey was far from over, but with each step forward, they were closer to safety. "We'll make it," she whispered to herself, almost as if trying to convince her own heart. The path to New Ulm was long, and the settlers' bodies were exhausted from the journey, but they couldn't afford to stop. Elizabeth's feet were sore, and the weight of her injuries had taken its toll. Still, she kept moving, one step at a time, pushing through the pain. The Dakota warriors had already inflicted so much destruction on their lives, but they couldn't allow themselves to be overtaken now. Elizabeth kept her eyes focused on the horizon, where the town of New Ulm waited, a beacon of hope after so much suffering. The road was filled with uncertainty, but Elizabeth clung to the knowledge that they had survived so far, and that, for her children's sake, was enough to keep going. Just as the settlers thought they were making progress, the sound of hooves pounding behind them reminded them that the Dakota were still on their trail. Elizabeth's chest tightened as she turned to listen. The riders were closing in, their voices carrying across the prairie. "We need to move faster," John urged, his tone sharp with urgency. Elizabeth nodded, holding her children close. The journey had become a race against time, a push to stay ahead of forces that showed no sign of slowing. Every step mattered as they ran through the thick grass, their legs aching but their determination unbroken. After hours of running, they reached a small, abandoned farmstead. The door creaked as Elizabeth pushed it open, and for the first time in days, a quiet sense of relief settled over them. Moonlight stretched across the broken walls, casting shadows, but the tension in her body began to ease. Merton quickly checked the perimeter, ensuring no one was following. Elizabeth watched him and realized how much her children had changed. They had grown stronger, more alert, learning to navigate a world that demanded resilience. For now, they were safe. And that alone was enough. The next morning, the settlers continued their journey toward New Ulm, urgency pressing on every step. Elizabeth knew they couldn't keep moving forever. Supplies were low, and their strength was waning. But the Dakota were still nearby, and they had to maintain their pace. "We have to reach New Ulm, no matter what," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "It's the only chance we have." John nodded, his face resolute. They had endured so much already, and they couldn't afford any setbacks. Each step carried them closer to safety. Progress was slow, and the days began to blur together. Just as they felt some measure of hope, another familiar figure appeared. Pawn, now alone. His expression was unreadable, and Elizabeth felt a chill of unease. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice calm but deliberate. "We're heading to New Ulm," John replied carefully, keeping his eyes on him. Pawn lingered, silent, before turning away. The settlers had no choice but to keep moving, aware that trust was fragile, and that every encounter could shift their path. Even as they pressed onward, danger was not over. A group of Dakota riders emerged from the trees, and Elizabeth quickly realized they had been led into a trap. She gathered her children close, scanning for any opportunity to move forward. The settlers managed to avoid direct confrontation, but the threat was clear. Escape required constant vigilance. Elizabeth's mind raced, thinking through each step and every turn. There was no pause, no moment to relax. They had to keep moving, or risk being caught once more. When they finally reached New Ulm, the settlers found refuge among those who had already survived the war. The town was filled with soldiers and civilians alike, all of them survivors of the brutal conflict that had ravaged Minnesota. Elizabeth stood at the entrance to New Ulm, her body exhausted but her heart full of hope. They had made it. They had survived the Dakota War. And now, they could begin again. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Elizabeth and the other settlers began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. It wasn't easy, and the scars of the war remained. But there was hope now. The town of New Ulm had become a sanctuary, a place where survivors could heal and rebuild. Elizabeth, though scarred by the war, found strength in her family and community. They had endured the worst, and now they had a chance to build a future. As the years passed, Elizabeth became a part of the history of New Ulm. Her story, along with the stories of all the settlers who had survived the war, was passed down to future generations. The Dakota War was no longer a tale of loss and destruction. It was a story of survival, resilience, and community. Elizabeth knew that the war would never be forgotten, but she also knew that the future was something that could be shaped. Her family had survived, and they would continue to thrive in a world that had once seemed so hostile. Elizabeth's children had grown into adults, each of them taking on roles in their community. Merton was now a man, married with children of his own, and Johnny had become a strong young man, carrying the lessons of survival with him. Elizabeth looked at them with pride, knowing they had overcome what many thought impossible. Her legacy was not one of bloodshed or war. It was a legacy of survival, of strength, and of the will to continue even when everything seemed lost. In the years that followed, New Ulm gradually transformed from a town gripped by fear into a community beginning to heal. The settlers who had endured the war, like Elizabeth and her family, worked to rebuild not just their homes, but a sense of safety and stability. There was an unspoken bond among them. They were united by shared experiences of hardship, loss, and resilience. Elizabeth often reflected on the past, remembering the days when Dakota war cries filled the air. Though the memories lingered, she found comfort in seeing her children strong, healthy, and secure. She realized she had given them a future shaped by lessons learned, not defined by past horrors. Even in the peace of New Ulm, Elizabeth could not escape lingering memories. Quiet moments, the stillness of night, and her children's questions often reminded her of the past. Merton had grown into a careful, thoughtful young man, carrying the responsibility of protecting his younger siblings. Johnny remained innocent, unaware of the hardships they had faced. Elizabeth knew that one day he would understand. When she looked at her children, she saw more than survivors. They were the future she had fought to safeguard. Elizabeth often thought about the Dakota, warriors striving to endure just as fiercely. She had spent years learning about the Dakota War, broken treaties, and the conditions that had driven both sides into conflict. She understood that survivors on every side were marked by the events. Elizabeth had lost neighbors, peace, and security. But she had gained resilience and a deeper understanding of survival. As she shared her story with the community, she taught her children and grandchildren that the legacy of survival was about courage, compassion, and hope, not just endurance. Over time, Elizabeth realized that rebuilding was more than restoring homes, it was healing hearts. Her children took roles in the community, helping others who had endured the war. They became pillars of strength for New Ulm, just as Elizabeth had been for them. Challenges remained. Memories of the past occasionally resurfaced, but together they faced them with determination. One evening, Merton arrived with his own family. "Mom, meet my children," he said. Pride swelled in her heart. He had become the kind, strong man she had always hoped he would be. Holding her grandchildren close, Elizabeth understood that the legacy of love, survival, and community would continue. Even as life normalized, the war's impact lingered. Elizabeth often visited the sites where hardship had struck, pausing for reflection. She thought about the difficult choices and the lessons learned. Stories of struggle and displacement continued to surface, but Elizabeth knew that healing wasn't forgetting, it was acknowledging the past while building a better future. Her focus was on fostering a community where history informed decisions but did not define daily life. As Elizabeth aged, her body slowed, but her mind stayed sharp. She spent her days surrounded by her children and grandchildren, sharing lessons of courage and resilience. One evening, as the sun set over Lake Shedek, she sat with Merton and Johnny, heart full. "You've done it," she said softly. "You've persevered." Merton smiled, though a quiet awareness of the past weighed on him. "We've endured, Mom, and we carry what we've learned." Elizabeth nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, but it does not define us. We move forward, together." In her final days, Elizabeth shared her legacy with her family. She spoke of the courage needed to endure and the strength to keep moving forward even when circumstances seemed impossible. Her story became one of reconciliation, teaching the importance of living with scars while building a brighter future. Surrounded by loved ones, she knew her story would endure. She had given her family tools to thrive, and it was now their turn to carry the torch. After Elizabeth passed, her children and grandchildren honored her memory by continuing to share her story. They passed down lessons of resilience, empathy, and hope. New Ulm, once defined by fear, had become a community of promise. Merton, now older, told his grandchildren about the struggles, sacrifices, and the inner strength that had carried the family through. The story was no longer only about surviving, it was about building a meaningful life. Though the Dakota had been removed from Minnesota, their experiences remained in settlers' memories. Elizabeth came to understand that the war was more than settlers versus Dakota. It reflected two peoples pushed to extremes by broken promises and desperation. She learned to see the Dakota as human beings, facing impossible circumstances. Elizabeth's journey became one of reconciliation, showing that true healing comes from understanding and acknowledgement. In her final days, Elizabeth found peace knowing her family would continue her legacy. The hardships of the Dakota War had shaped them into resilient, wise individuals. Through it all, she had taught a vital lesson. Survival was not just enduring, it was about shaping a better future from lessons learned. Her family, once divided by fear, had grown stronger through shared experience, and Elizabeth knew their story would endure for generations. Elizabeth Eastlick's life, from peaceful settlement to the Dakota War and its aftermath, was a testament to endurance and resilience. She and her family had faced trials, adapted, and rebuilt. Her legacy was more than survival, it was creating a future filled with hope, community, and lessons carried forward. Through hardship, Elizabeth gave her family the tools to thrive, shaping a world where they could live in peace while honoring what they had endured. If this story moves you, please like, share, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to follow every chapter of this journey.